The morning I found the envelope, I was carrying 2 cups of coffee. That was the thing nobody tells you about moments that split your life in two. They arrive while you're doing something completely ordinary. I had just brewed a fresh pot, the way I did every morning for 31 years. 2 cups, one for me, one for my wife. I set hers on the counter by the window where she liked to sit and watch the birds at the feeder. Then I saw it. A white envelope propped against the sugar bowl. My name written on the front in her handwriting. Not a birthday card handwriting. Not a grocery list handwriting. Something careful. Something deliberate. The kind of handwriting a person uses when they've practiced what they want to say. I set both cups down. I stood there for a moment, looking at my name Robert written in blue ink by the woman who had shared my bed since 1993. Then I picked it up and opened it. There were 2 pages inside. The first was a letter. The second was a document I didn't immediately recognize. I read the letter first. She said she hadn't been happy in a long time. She said she'd tried to tell me, but I never listened. She said she deserved more than what we had built together. She said the house, our house, the colonial on Birchwood Lane in Asheville that we'd bought in 2004 and paid off together in 2019, had already been listed. She had signed a listing agreement with an agent 3 weeks earlier. She said she was staying with her sister in Charlotte until things were sorted out. She said she was sorry, but not in a way that sounded like she meant it. Then I looked at the second page. It was a power of attorney document, signed by me, dated 14 months ago. I remembered that document. I had signed it at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, while she stood next to me and explained it was for estate planning purposes. We had just come back from her mother's funeral. I was grieving. She handed me a pen and pointed to the signature line. I signed it. I had not read it carefully. I sat down in the chair by the window and looked at the bird feeder. A pair of cardinals was working through the sunflower seeds. The coffee steamed in both cups and then slowly went cold. I did not cry. I'm not sure why. I think some part of me, some quiet, older part of me that had watched more than I ever said out loud, was not entirely surprised. But surprised and prepared are 2 very different things. I picked up my phone and called my daughter in Portland. She didn't answer. I left no message. Then I sat there for another 20 minutes and thought about the only thing that seemed worth thinking about. What, exactly, had she done? And what, exactly, could I still do? Those 2 questions were the beginning of everything that came next. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I am not a man who moves quickly. I never have been. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer, and if that career taught me one thing, it's that the most important decisions are never made in the first hour. Buildings that collapse do so because someone rushed a calculation somewhere. Someone assumed instead of verified. Someone felt confident when they should have felt careful. So, I did not call a lawyer that morning. I did not call my wife. I did not drive to her sister's house in Charlotte. I drove to the county recorder's office. The clerk there was a woman named Diane, who I recognized from the years I'd spent pulling permits for renovation work. She looked up from her computer when I walked in and said, "Mr. Hale, haven't seen you in a while." I told her I needed to look at the property records for 114 Birchwood Lane. She pulled them up and turned the screen so I could see. The listing was real. The power of attorney was real. And there was something else, something my wife's letter had not mentioned. There was already a purchase offer on the property, submitted 6 days earlier, for $412,000, $12,000 below asking, but still, 6 days earlier, while I was home. While we were eating dinner together and watching television, and she was passing me the salt and asking if I wanted more water. The buyer was listed as a property investment LLC out of Raleigh. I wrote the name down on a piece of paper, Meridian Crest Holdings. I thanked Diane and walked back to my truck. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. Then I drove home and I made a fresh pot of coffee and I opened my laptop and I started reading. By 9 o'clock that night, I knew what Meridian Crest Holdings was. It had been registered with the North Carolina Secretary of State 11 months ago. Its registered agent was an attorney in Raleigh named Victor Alderman. Its single listed member was a man named Glenn Forsyth. I had never heard of Glenn Forsyth, but I knew how to find out who he was. My son-in-law works in commercial insurance. He knows people who know people. I called him that evening and asked him, as casually as I could, if the name Glenn Forsyth meant anything to him in connection with real estate investment in the Raleigh-Charlotte corridor. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, why are you asking me this at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday?" I told him it was a professional curiosity. He didn't believe me, but he said he'd ask around. He called back 40 minutes later. Glenn Forsyth, 54 years old, ran a private investment group that primarily flipped undervalued residential properties. He had a house in Raleigh and a condo in Wilmington. He had been divorced once, in 2017. He was known in certain circles as a man who moved fast and negotiated hard, and was not above acquiring properties in circumstances that benefited from the seller's urgency. And then my son-in-law said something that made me set my coffee cup down very slowly. He said, "Someone I talked to mentioned seeing him at a fundraiser in Asheville last spring at the Grove Park. Apparently he was there with a woman. I don't know who she was." I asked him what month. He said April. In April, my wife had told me she was attending a weekend retreat with her book club in Asheville. She'd come home Sunday evening with a tote bag full of paperback novels and said it had been exactly what she needed. I thanked my son-in-law. I told him not to mention this conversation to anyone, including my daughter. He said, "Dad, are you okay?" I told him I was fine. I was not fine, but I was focused. And in my experience, focused is better. I called a real estate attorney the next morning. Her name was Patricia Wemberton, and she'd been recommended to me by a colleague from my engineering days who said she was the sharpest property lawyer in Western North Carolina. She had an office on Lexington Avenue, 2 blocks from the farmer's market. I sat across from her and laid out what I knew: the POA, the listing, the purchase offer, the name of the buyer, the timeline. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took off her reading glasses and looked at me steadily. "You signed the POA," she said. "I did. Did you understand its scope when you signed it?" "I understood it less than I should have." She nodded slowly. The good news is that a power of attorney does not grant unlimited authority. It cannot be used for self-dealing or transactions that benefit the agent at the expense of the principal. If your wife used this POA to facilitate a sale to a buyer with whom she has a personal relationship, particularly if she stands to benefit from the proceeds in a way that excludes you, that's a significant problem for heir. What kind of problem? The kind that voids transactions and creates liability. I asked her what I should do. She said the first thing I needed to do was revoke the POA immediately. In writing, notarized, filed with the county recorder. She said the second thing I needed to do was send a written notice to the listing agent and the buyer's attorney stating that the listing agreement was unauthorized and the property was not available for sale. I asked about the purchase offer that had already been submitted. She said, "Has it been accepted?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Find out." Today, I drove back to the recorder's office. The offer had not yet been accepted. There was a 3-day window that had not yet closed. I called Patricia from the parking lot. She said, "Good. Here's what we do next." What we did next took 9 days. There were letters, filings, phone calls, a very tense conversation with the listing agent who told me she had been assured by Mrs. Hale that she had full authority to list the property. I told her politely that she had been misinformed and that her firm might want to speak with its own legal counsel before proceeding. The listing was suspended. Meridian Crest Holdings withdrew their offer. And somewhere in Charlotte, I imagined, my wife's phone was ringing with calls she did not want to receive. She came back on a Thursday. I heard the garage door and then her footsteps in the kitchen, and I was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, the same way I'd been sitting most mornings that week. She stopped in the doorway when she saw me. She said, "Robert." I said, "Hello." She put her bag down on the counter. She looked at the table, at the legal pad, at me. She had the expression of someone who had prepared for a conversation and arrived to find the furniture rearranged. "I assume you've been talking to a lawyer," she said. "I have. The sale isn't going through." "No, it isn't." She sat down across from me. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The bird feeder outside was empty. I hadn't filled it since the morning I found the envelope. I noticed that now. She said, "I wasn't trying to steal from you. You listed our jointly owned home without my knowledge or consent, using a document I signed under false pretenses, to sell it to a man you had a personal relationship with. Help me understand how that's different." She was quiet. I said, "I need you to understand something. I'm not angry." And I meant it, which surprised me a little. "I'm clear. There's a difference. Angry people make mistakes. Clear people make decisions." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "What decisions?" I want to explain something about those next 3 months, because they matter. My wife had assumed, I think genuinely assumed, that I was the kind of man who would be bewildered by paperwork, who would call her, confused and upset, and ask her to come home and explain, who would ultimately defer to whatever she had already arranged because he didn't know what else to do. That assumption was 31 years out of date. What she did not know, because I had not told her, was that 2 years earlier I had begun quietly restructuring my retirement assets. Not out of suspicion, out of habit. I was an engineer. I modeled for contingencies. Our financial advisor had suggested consolidating certain accounts into a trust structure for tax efficiency purposes, and I had done exactly that with the guidance of an estate attorney I'd hired independently. What this meant, practically, was that the house on Birchwood Lane, which she had attempted to sell, was, as of 14 months ago, the only significant asset remaining in my personal name. Everything else had been moved. She had aimed at the one thing. She had almost gotten it. Almost. The divorce was filed in October. Her attorney was a man from Charlotte named Desmond Pratt, who wore expensive suits and had a reputation for aggressive asset discovery. He sent Patricia a letter requesting a full accounting of my financial holdings within 30 days. Patricia sent him the accounting. It was thorough. It was accurate. And it was, by the standards of what he'd been expecting, extremely thin. I had my pension. I had my truck. I had a modest checking account. I had the house on Birchwood Lane, now with a contested title and an active list, pendens notice. Mr. Pratt called Patricia the following Tuesday. She told me later that he asked, "Where are the rest of his assets?" She told him there were no other assets in my name. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not possible." Patricia said, "I'd encourage you to review the documentation we provided." There was a long pause. Then he said, "We'll be in touch." The hearing was in February. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Catherine Mabe, who had been on the family court bench in Buncombe County for 16 years. She had the kind of face that had heard everything twice and was no longer impressed by any of it. My wife's attorney argued that the trust structure had been established specifically to shield assets from her in anticipation of divorce. He called it deliberate financial concealment. Patricia stood up and presented the documentation, showing the trust had been established 22 months ago, well before any evidence of marital discord could be established, on the recommendation of a certified financial planner acting in a professional capacity, and that all transfers had been properly reported and disclosed per state and federal requirements. Judge Mabe looked at the documents for a long time. Then she looked at Mr. Pratt. She said, "Counsel, restructuring marital finances for legitimate tax and estate planning purposes is not concealment. It is prudence." Mr. Pratt started to respond. She held up one hand. She said, "Furthermore, the attempted sale of jointly owned marital property without the co-owner's knowledge, using a power of attorney obtained under circumstances this court finds troubling, is precisely the kind of action that undermines your client's position in these proceedings." The room was very quiet. My wife was sitting at the table to my left. I did not look at her, but I heard her exhale a small, careful sound, like a person setting something heavy down. The settlement took another 4 months to finalize. I will not walk through every detail of it, because most of it was paperwork and waiting, which is what legal processes mostly are. What mattered at the end of it was this. The house on Birchwood Lane went to mediation. Given the attempted unauthorized sale, the lis pendens, and the involvement of a third party with a personal relationship to my wife, the mediator recommended a buyout arrangement. I could purchase her half of the equity at a court-assessed valuation, or we could sell to an arm's-length buyer and split the proceeds under court supervision. I chose to buy her out. Patricia arranged the financing within 2 weeks. My wife received her share of the equity fair, as it should be, whatever else had happened, and she moved to Charlotte. I filed the paperwork to fill the bird feeder on a Thursday morning in June. I realize that's a strange way to put it, but that's what it felt like. A filing. A completion of something that had been left unfinished. I want to tell you about the last phone call, because it's the part I think about the most. It was a Saturday in July, 3 weeks after everything was finalized. I was on the back porch reading when my phone buzzed. It was her. I looked at the name on the screen for a moment, and then I answered. She said, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how I did it. The letter, the POA, I know that wasn't right." I said, "I know you are." She said, I thought you wouldn't fight. I thought you just let it happen." I said, "I know." There was a long pause. She said, "Who are you, Robert?" And I thought about that question. I thought about 31 years of quiet mornings and bird feeders and 2 cups of coffee going cold. I thought about the envelope on the counter and the drive to the recorder's office and the 9 days of letters and filings. I thought about Patricia and Judge Mabe and the sound of my wife exhaling in that courtroom. I said, I'm someone who reads things carefully before he signs them. Now, she didn't say anything to that. We said goodbye. She hung up. I put the phone face down on the armrest and looked out at the yard. The Cardinals were back at the feeder. Both of them, the bright red male and the quieter brown female, working through the seeds together the way they always had, the way they always would, because some things continue regardless of what the people watching them are going through. I picked up my book. The afternoon light was long and gold across the porch floorboards. I was 63 years old. The house was mine. The morning was quiet. That, it turned out, was enough.